let's talk for a bit about paganism. Welcome to the episode where we talk about what paganism is, why it matters, why people practice it, and generally what it means. Something that I think, by the way, is important for heathens and the heathen curious to talk about, since, broadly speaking, all forms of heathenry are part of this bigger movement. How I'm going to do this is I'm going to kick things off by first talking about some definitions based on my experience and what's generally accepted in the pagan movement, the structure of the pagan community and how that influences the way that it functions, where it comes from, why someone might engage in pagan practice, speaking, of course, from my own perspective, the question of magic and mysticism, and what this could all mean for the future of a planet where ecological awareness and ecological crisis is becoming more pressing than ever. But first, some definitions. The word pagan is one that conjures up a lot of different meanings, associations, and imagery. For most of modern society, it's often used as a sort of shorthand for superstitious or ritualistic behavior and ideas. If you move over to more, let's say, right-wing Christian circles and Christian supremacist ones, then the word takes on a much darker twist, standing in a lot of ways, for everything that Christianity is opposed to. It's also particularly used increasingly as a way of maligning pro-environmental policies, with one of the best examples being that one article from the Federalist, which I have linked in the show notes, where the authors accuse Greta Thunberg, the climate activist, of being some kind of New Age goddess messiah, and that the rise of young people rightly fighting to protect the planet and ensure they have something to live on and something resembling a future is actually a new religious movement attempting to overthrow everything that makes civilization what it is. These definitions are ones that tend to leave out actual pagans, and also don't really get into the meat of what paganism is now. It's also worth talking about on this podcast because, generally speaking, you could say heathenry, as a form of religious expression, is part of this bigger pagan movement. So what then is paganism? Paganism, in my experience, is a term that refers to a group of modern forms of spirituality which first began to emerge in the early 20th century and truly began to explode as a serious religious movement starting in the 1960s. Paganism is also something of an umbrella term rather than a singular religious body or form of religious practice. There are many kinds of paganisms that are held together more by our shared traits, areas of overlap, as well as shared spaces than necessarily a shared singular creed. What all paganisms generally have in common is they tend to be nature-based in their spirituality, involve some kind of polytheistic understanding of deity, which means there are many different gods. This understanding of deity and otherworldly powers also tends to be very strongly animistic, though not always. And there is a broad acceptance, though again, the details vary, of the uses of divination, magic, and other mystical practices, most modern paganisms also derive their inspiration, by and large, from the pre-Christian forms of spirituality which existed in Europe, the Mediterranean basin, and the Middle East prior to the coming of Christianity and Islam, along with more recent sources of spiritual and mystical expression that come out of the European occult tradition, which first began emerging in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance and continued on to the present day. Though there are some who try to lump different forms of indigenous spirituality as well as polytheistic spiritualities like Hindu practice and Japanese Shinto under the pagan umbrella, these groups, as well as indigenous groups, tend to hold themselves apart, and it is actually kind of overstepping bounds in a lot of ways to lump them in when they do not really consider themselves to be part of the pagan movement. This is also complicated by that elements of the pagan movement have a history of engaging in cultural appropriation from these different spiritualities by practitioners of all levels of experience, position, and recognition within their respective communities. For folks outside of this movement, the words pagan and witch are often treated as synonymous terms, though, as many practicing pagans know quite well, these two things are not always the same. There is absolutely broad overlap with witchcraft and witch-based spirituality, particularly around goddess-oriented spirituality, Wicca, different traditions of witchcraft like reclaiming, and other similar practices. But not all witches are necessarily pagans, and not all pagans are necessarily or would identify themselves as being witches. In fact, it's not uncommon within the pagan community and within particular pagan practices for being a witch to be a specific discipline within their form of spirituality rather than a catch-all identifier or an expected form of mysticism that everyone engages in. What further complicates this is paganism, as well as the many different paganisms, including all the different forms of heathenry and the many heathenries that are running around in the world, lack any kind of centralized body or coordinating force. This is very important for understanding this community and this broad collection of related religious movements. There is no one Church of Wicca, or official order of Druids, or anything similar. And there's certainly nothing like the kind of Illuminati conspiracy theories that you'll find in the pages of, say, a Jack Chick tract. There certainly are religious organizations that exist within the different pagan traditions, varying from the example we have of, say, Wicca, where there are several small and large established organizations, with one of the larger ones, the Covenant of the Goddess, being more of a federation and coalition of Wiccan covens than necessarily being a top-down singular church. Reclaiming witchcraft, which is much more of a closely defined tradition that does have something of a coordinating organization and specific set of unifying tenets. The various druid orders ranging from small, localized groups to larger groups like the ADF and the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, and inclusive heathenry, where again, there's a lot of local and regional groups, as well as larger national and international organizations like a Satrufellescapet Bifrost in Norway, a Satrufellagid in Iceland, the Troth in the United States, Canada, and parts of Europe, and many other organizations of different size and scope. You could think of the more organized groups as being something similar to Christian denominations, like, say, what you see in Protestant Christianity, though that would require assuming that Christian norms really work for explaining how paganism works. I think a better way to approach this movement is to think of it less as being a series of organized denominations and churches, and more as several different magnetic poles that are scattered across a broad field, which is the broader pagan movement. These poles are some of the different, more specific traditions. Like, for example, you can have a heathenry pole over here, a druid pole over here, witches and witchcraft-derived traditions over here, and so on. And people gravitate towards whichever poles they feel most strongly associated with. Sometimes this means you get people who cluster very closely around one specific pole, and they hold to that throughout their entire spiritual life. Other times, you'll have people that will drift between different poles as their attraction to different forms of spiritualities waxes and wanes. You also, quite commonly, have folks who sit quite comfortably in between two particular poles, mixing from, for example, heathen practice and witchcraft, or druidry and modern Hellenic, which is to say Greek, polytheistic reconstructionism, and all kinds of other similar combinations. There's also quite a few folks who are genuine practitioners of indigenous spirituality who also mix in a bit of pagan practice in what they do, and sometimes have a foot in both worlds. This metaphor of poles and fields is important because the different kinds of paganisms that exist are not tightly defined boxes or containers that lack overlap or butt up against each other and have some bleed over. It's more of a very complex gradient with all kinds of ranges, combinations, and influences. What also further assists the development of this broad kind of set of poles and fields is that the vast majority of pagan practitioners, regardless of specific sect or tradition, are what are referred to as solitary practitioners. What this means is they are a lone individual who has no regular community that they interact with, either in person or online. One of the main reasons why pagans tend to be solitary is because our community generally is very underground. In some parts of the world and many parts of the United States, it's quite easy to have things happen like lose your job or face harassment in your communities if you become outed as a pagan. So there's very few of what you could call visible above ground groups. And even the ones that are tend to have far less in the way of resources than is the case for, say, mainstream religious and Christian denominations. This means there is a lot of self-teaching, individualized development, and broad ranges of interpretations on top of bodies of myth and work that already lend themselves to alternative and nuanced interpretations as opposed to simply superficial readings of them. It's not uncommon for there to be pagans who, like me, started through personal exploration in their teens or possibly even younger and already have years of practice by the time they become adults, as well as lots of other folks who come to it later in life Another factor contributing to this blend is that a lot of different pagan groups have significant overlap between the two for a variety of reasons, including things like broad agreement on core elements of practice, and also the tendency in many pagan communities for there to only be a handful of organized groups who meet regularly, and these organized groups often become hubs for local and regional communities. It's not uncommon to see situations where, say, for example, the biggest game in town is a very active coven of witches who hold open circles in a public park where you will find solitary druids, heathens, or other polytheists showing up and participating because that's what's there and it's the best community they're going to find, at least as far as they know. There are some exceptions to this, like, say, the Bay Area of San Francisco, where there are several established organizations of several different traditions. But this is more the exception rather than the rule of one or two particularly coherent and active organizations being the main hub for that particular community. What also assists all this blending and overlap and everything else is that paganisms are actually pretty good at working together. The fact that we tend to agree more on core precepts of practice rather than disagree, and also don't really have any particular strictures or commandments like "thou shalt have no other god before me," means that you see quite a bit of mixing, matching, and blending going on. This is also something that has quite a bit of historical basis as well. When we look at examples of extant polytheistic cultures, like, say, Hindu practice in South Asia, what you find is a dizzying array of syncretism, local and regional practice, overlap, blending, as well as new innovation. When we look historically at, like, say, the Mediterranean basin before and during the Roman Empire, there was quite a bit of adoption, intermixing, syncretism, and even the creation of new gods brought together from multiple pre-existing ones. One of the best examples of the pluralistic tendencies of polytheism is the cult of Isis from the days of the Roman Empire. At the time of when Constantine became the emperor of Rome, and then began the process of converting the empire to his chosen religion, one of the largest religious groups, one that actually probably had at least as many adherents as Christianity, was the cult of Isis. And we even find evidence of the cult of Isis being practiced in the city of Rome itself well up into the dying days of the empire in the 5th century. The cult of Mithras was also a popular one, even though it was originally derived from their neighboring Persian rivals, with widespread adherence and worship throughout the Roman military. This all happened alongside the official cult of the deified Roman emperors, as well as the religious customs and festivals sponsored by the Senate and people of Rome as the official body of worship in the empire. Indeed, instances of religious suppression under Rome tended to less be driven by differences of spiritual interpretation and more by some underlying political reasons, such as, usually, rising in rebellion against the empire. Based on this history, as well as current circumstances, I suspect that's going to probably continue to be the case for the pagan movement going forward, that there's going to continue to be these poles, these points of specifically defined practice, which become sources of ideas, ritual, and community who influence many different practitioners that move between these different poles exist in a state of overlap between them, and otherwise adopt what works best for them. So you're probably wondering, how is it that a bunch of ancient spirituality, which engages in practices which many modern people would call mystical mumbo-jumbo, worshipping dead gods, came into being in the modern day? The three big historical factors behind the emergence of modern paganism are the New Age movement and 60s counterculture, our present ecological crisis, which has been escalating for longer than I've been alive, but certainly picking up steam during my lifetime, and the failings and failures of modern Christianity. The New Age movement and modern counterculture are an obvious starting point for modern paganism. And it's quite true that for a while, and in many places this is still more true than others, there's been significant overlap between what is New Age and what is pagan. The same is also true of occult circles. Like, these are all sort of like interlocking and overlapping movements that were all coming up within the broader framework of the 60s counterculture. It's also important to note, by the way, that the 60s counterculture is often idealized by modern folks generally, and particularly, millennials and Zoomers and stuff, as some kind of idealized, consistently progressive and radical period. And this sort of progressive and radical, challenge across the board to all institutions. And the fact is that while there were certain elements that challenged the mainstream and the norms of the 1960s and early 1970s in the counterculture, it was still also pretty deeply rooted in things like traditional gender norms and expectations. It also had a lot of different strains which tapped into ideas that came from a lot more dubious places. Like, for example, the same sort of fever swamps of material that inspired things like theosophy, Ariosophy, and some of the elements of Hindu spirituality that become co-opted by authors like Julius Evola to justify outright fascist ideology. So, it's important to keep this in mind. We're not talking something that's monolithically always producing things that we like and approve of. It's more that counterculture in this period is a reaction to everything that is sort of the conformity and the specific materialist obsessions, and to an extent the sort of emptiness that came with, well, now we have the house and the white picket fence and a basic level of prosperity. Now what do we do when day after day your work is you go in for 8 hours and you do the same mechanical rote processes all day, which can be kind of, mind-numbing and boring. Parallel to this was also the big revolts that were coming from colonized and marginalized peoples and places, and American Indian movement and civil rights and all kinds of other stuff. So this isn't just something that is a bunch of folks sitting around dropping acid and becoming one with the universe and generally coming to the same kind of opinions we hold today. It's more just this broader soup that's in the middle of all this ferment. So that's important to understand, that originally paganism's roots, while stretching a little bit further back, like Gerald Gardner, for example, started doing his stuff in the 20s and 30s, and he absolutely compared notes with Crowley and a bunch of other early writers who influenced early pagan movements, but rather this counterculture turbocharges it. And this is also happening alongside the rise of New Age ideas, of stuff like the repopularization of the Atlantis myth, and also some outright conspiracy theory stuff too. I mean, we do have to acknowledge there's a bit of that runs around in all of these shared spaces. So this creates an answer to the ennui of post-war consumer life. It's not always a good answer, But that is where it's coming from, and that's a big influence on what makes paganism what it is, that it's another way of saying, well, I'm dropping out of this bigger thing that is society, and I'm doing something that also is more in line with point number 2, which is the environment, nature, and the cycles of the earth. Now, when people like Gerald Gardner or Margaret Mead or some of these other different early figures that you're going to hear people talk about in pagan practice are doing their thing, their understanding is a much more romanticized, like kind of almost Tolkienish, like reverence for the idea of nature. And some of this is coming out of like genuine revulsion with the products of industrialization. But it also comes from a certain kind of fetishization of the people of the countryside as being more authentically English or what have you. This starts to change beginning in the mid to late 60s when you have two fairly important events that kick off the modern green movement. The first is the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, a book which drew attention to the growing harm being done to environments and ecosystems around the world and what this could mean for human life. As this conversation is happening, you then get a very powerful visual that enters the discussion, which completely changes everything, and that is the publication of the first pictures of Earth taken from orbit by the Apollo lander from the moon. These images of a fragile pale blue dot makes a big shift in how you start to see what becomes the green movement talks about the Earth and the environment and the world around us. The movement then continues to grow, seeing early successes like Earth Day, the establishment of the EPA in the United States, the Clean Air and Water Act, and so on, which dovetails really well with paganism's general love of the environment and reverence for the natural world. This has only accelerated with the growth of the green movement, the development of things like eco-media in the late 80s and 90s, growing awareness of global warming and climate change, and everything up to where the climate and environmental justice movements are now. It would be a stretch to say that all environmentalists are closet pagans, even though folks like the Federalist like to make that claim. But it would be accurate to say that growing ecological consciousness has correlated with the growth of interest in pagan and earth-based spiritualities as an alternative to a society that has, pushed the biosphere to the brink and is putting life on Earth as we know it in jeopardy. It would also be fair to say that most pagans on some level hold some kind of strongly pro-environmental understandings of the world, politics, and their relationship to society. Even the most apolitical pagan groups will at least put out statements and give some kind of nod towards the need for environmental action and do things like local cleanups of beaches and parks and stuff like that. I think as ecological awareness becomes more front and center in people's minds, more people are going to turn to forms of spirituality and adaptations of existing forms of spirituality which engage with this reality. Now, that said, just because someone is an environmentalist doesn't, as the Federalist in the linked article tries to argue, mean that one is a pagan. To put it really simply, available data and research suggests that the overall pagan population in the United States, of all pagan traditions, by the way, and this includes to an extent the witch subculture, because the way that these surveys tend to be done doesn't really distinguish between witch and pagan, and also tends to assume that core elements of witch spirituality are true for all pagans. But anyway, leaving that aside, current estimates peg the overall population at somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 million people, which if we're going to be generous, stretches to maybe 1% of the population of the United States of America. The overall percentage of people who value environmentalism, engage in the green movement, have done things like climate marches and the March for Science and all these other things that are connected to climate change, is a significantly larger percentage in number than 1% and a few million. To put it very directly, if paganism and environmentalism were one and the same, there'd be a lot more of us running around. We'd be a much more visible part of life. And the folks who are trying to say that there's no difference between having environmental sensitivities and being a pagan would probably be frothing at the mouth and tearing down the walls of society. I mean, it would make things so much easier for all of us if environmentalism was synonymous with paganism, because then there'd be way more pagans, and it'd be way easier for us to do stuff. But so it goes. That brings us to item number 3, Christianity's failings and failures. Many pagans come from spiritual backgrounds that are Christian or Christian influenced. Even for pagans who come from a relatively secular background. Like I, for example, came from a family where my dad was what you could call a Star Trek atheist, basically, and my mom was at best a Christmas and Easter Presbyterian. And we stopped even doing that much church before I was even 10 years old. And yes, I did do a little bit of Sunday school and vacation Bible school, but nothing serious. Even so, I still went to school at a high school where on 3 of the 4 sides of the high school, there was a church. Somebody handing out Bibles or chick tracts or preaching outside the gates of school was a common occurrence. The point I'm making with this little personal anecdote is even for pagans who aren't in more extreme Christian sects than that, and those sects are quite common these days, there is a pervasive sense of Christianity as the dominant form of religious expression. This has also been happening in an environment where large chunks of particularly American Christianity, but also Christianity in Europe and other parts of the world, has been getting increasingly, extreme. When I say extreme, I mean things like the rise of Christian nationalism, the stuff that helped make January 6th happen. Extreme social conservatism, which is starting to manifest now in the form of things like don't say gay bills and laws criminalizing the existence of trans people. Or, similarly, the anti-choice movement and their campaigns to restrict the bodily autonomy of women. This has also been a time in which these same elements of Christianity, who have been becoming increasingly visible, increasingly abusive, increasingly getting caught being abusive, such as, for example, the recent allegations against the Church of Latter-day Saints and the Southern Baptist Convention, which both sound a lot like very similar allegations of systemic sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, have been unfolding. This is also, initially American Christianity, but now increasingly other forms of Christianity which are in contact with these more reactionary American elements, has become increasingly conspiratorial, increasingly obsessed with persecution narratives, and openly, or not so openly, embracing stuff like QAnon. This is on top of already existing problems like the strongly ingrained sexism in many Christian denominations, the history of anti-LGBT attitudes in most of Christianity. There are some exceptions, of course, and some denominations who have gotten better, but I'm talking by and large the general tendency, as well as this struggle and the impact this has had on people. People who eventually end up becoming pagans. Paganism would not be growing at the rate it is,
or reaching the growing level of public visibility that it has, if not for the fact that the dominant form of religious expression in the societies where paganism is springing up has really been falling down on the job. And that falling down on the job also leads to bigger theological questions that paganism answers better for those folks. Questions like, how am I supposed to have a sense of agency or relationship with a divinity that is all-powerful, all-knowing, and utterly incomprehensible to human beings? I mean, yes, modern evangelical Christianity does talk a lot about the personal relationship one has with Jesus, but that can be pretty intimidating to be in relationship with something that is supposed to be completely perfect. And pagan gods, for all their flaws, tend to be a lot more relatable. Not to mention, also kind of interesting in a certain way. Like the stories that exist in the different bodies of myth that show up in paganism offer a mirror of the human experience that much more closely matches what people actually see, hear, and experience in their lives. All of this is made possible by that Christianity has its own particular quirks and tendencies towards authoritarianism, hierarchy, and patriarchy that have, within my lifetime and quite a bit longer than that, been exacerbated and intensified by an increasing political drift in the direction of, at this point, basically fascism. Which brings us to the conversation about why do people become pagan? And broadly speaking, along with those initial push factors of growing ecological awareness within the last 2 generations, the New Age movement and how 60s counterculture changed the way we think about spirituality, and the failings of Christianity, 2 additional major pull factors are the DIY, do-it-yourself kind of attitude towards spirituality that exists within paganism, and that in some ways, though not always, paganism has ways of being more inclusive of people who are excluded by mainstream religion, particularly for members of the queer community. Now, the DIY self-expression part is pretty straightforward. Some pagan sects are a bit more organized and hierarchical about it than others, but for the most part, in paganism, ultimately the final authority on spirituality is you. What you do depends on if you find it fulfilling, and if it affirms and reinforces the relationships with the different gods or spirits or other powers that you're working with. How you do it is also something that can be a reflection of your circumstances. It's something that can be adjusted based on what you have and don't have to work with, what you know and what inspires you. Now, generally, there are lots of shared rituals, practices, and tendencies that exist within paganism broadly, as is true of all religious movements. But this DIY aspect is something that is especially important and is particularly central for understanding what makes paganism tick. Even though there are clergy, experienced mystics, teachers, and all kinds of other folks who serve as guides and advisors for people's spiritual journeys, ultimately each individual has the means to initiate a relationship with the powers without needing any special intercessor. If you want to work with a particular god, that's because you choose to do so. Or not, as you prefer. As for the question of inclusion, a thing I do want to get out of the way up front is paganism is, in a lot of ways, a reflection of broader society and is something of a microcosm of the societies it springs up in. It is also, at least in the United States, a community that tends to skew a bit more in the white direction in terms of demographics, in part because of the influences of things like the New Age movement and 60s counterculture, which included some fairly nasty influences. Like, that's where we get stuff like the Neo-Volkish movement, transphobic witches, and all kinds of other folks who have seized on to what's in paganism to justify new ways of acting out some old-fashioned bigotries. There is also a long history of cultural appropriation, particularly from indigenous groups in places like the Americas, that is being wrestled with within the community and is also something to be mindful and aware of. Now, all of these things said, generally speaking, the pagan movement tends to be much better about women and femme-identified people being accepted and welcomed into places of religious authority. In fact, it's safe to assume that probably a majority of the different authors out there are identified as women. There is also a significantly higher percentage of pagans who are queer identified in one way or another than there is in mainstream society. For example, the average percentage of any given population that is identified as transgender in some fashion or another, based on currently available numbers, because this is also something that's difficult to study and do effective reporting on, but based on what we know, it's around 1.5 to 2% of the overall population in mainstream society. In pagan spaces, it's not uncommon for the percentage of people who are trans to be at least 1 in 10, if not more. There's also significantly more in the way of people who are identified as gay, lesbian, bisexual, and all the other parts of the queer rainbow. Pagan groups also tend to articulate their theology in ways that encourage this kind of acceptiveness and inclusion, at least clearly along this particular axis. This is something that I think is also influenced by movements like the Radical Fairy gay movement, which absolutely has lots of places of overlap and exchange with the broader pagan community. And a lot of paganism's survival strategies around things like, terms like going in the closet and how to effectively operate as an underground community were first disseminated by queer pagans way back in the day. Folks who engage in other kinds of alternative lifestyle choices or members of different kink scenes and such also tend to be more represented in paganism because there really isn't much within different forms of pagan spirituality that condemns those things, and a lot that tends to accept it. The same is also true of other alternative groups and subcultures. It is safe to assume that most pagans tend to at least overlap, if not be part of some kind of subcultural group, whether you're talking things like goths or metalheads or fans of particular genres of fiction, particularly fantasy fiction, but not always. There's lots of these kinds of overlaps. So in a lot of ways, paganism, while it certainly is still wrestling with problems like transphobia and really living up to the inclusive potential and practice that exists in pagan spaces, as well as wrestling with overt and covert racism and colonialist attitudes, it does, at least in some ways, tend to be a bit better and more welcoming of difference and different forms of individual expression than mainstream society is. This is a good spot to also talk about one of the other things that brings people into pagan practice, which is the magic and mysticism. Now, often people outside the community ridicule this stuff as mumbo-jumbo and superstition and all that other stuff, but there really is a wide range of different philosophies, understandings, and approaches of the mystical practices, and there's a huge variety as to what they represent. It is quite common for people to come into the community looking for magical solutions to problems and turning to mysticism as a form of self-empowerment, but this usually is sort of the beginning, and folks that become more experienced tend to find more personal revelation and self-transformation out of these mystical practices than necessarily cheap parlor tricks or quick shortcuts to impressing one's friends and neighbors. Now, this is something that is its own big complicated topic. I recommend checking out some of the other episodes I've done on things like Sathe and the ecstatic state to sort of help get things started on this. But there is probably as many forms of pagan mysticism as there are pagans, and there are many different broad schools of thought. So it's kind of hard to say definitively that there's anything consistent about it, save that these different mystical traditions are an extension of that DIY sensibility. In paganism, you are not just something that is acted on by greater divine powers, you are also an actor within the broader cosmology and the stage of reality. And if nothing else, the mysticism, the magic, and the divination is a reflection and reinforcement of that place that we all hold in the world. So, to sort of wrap things up, that's my brief introduction to paganism, what it is, what it isn't, and some broad tendencies that you might expect, as well as why people are interested and why this movement erupted in the first place. If you want to learn more about Fire and Ice spirituality and practice, which is its own form of paganism and its own form of heathenry, to say the Nordic-derived forms of paganism, then head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find essays, resources, information on classes, and more. So thank you again for listening. This has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, signing off. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.